purpose of today's talk is to maybe disentangle some of the complexity here and see how, as a community, we can generate evidence collectively better, and also to present a framework that I think brings the pieces together. Next. तो कल के प्रेजेंटेशन में मैंने शायद एक ऐसा इमेज दिखाया था, मैप ऑफ इंडिया विद ह्यूमन पॉपुलेशन डेंसिटीज़. मैं ये रिपीट कर रहा हूँ, इसके कई कारण हैं. So broadly, if you think of social systems, each of these towers represents a certain number of people living in a certain space. And associated with that, there'll be complex levels and levels of systems that organize how humans operate. Governance systems, there'll be systems around which society is structured, there'll be economic systems and so on. Ecologically, the pale yellow areas on the map broadly represent forests in India. And I've just picked one species, tigers, for which there's information nationally, more or less. And these bars show you either density or abundance. It's mostly density. The red and blue bars are density of tigers across tiger-bearing areas in India. Now, if you see on this map, there are areas, there are habitat that have good numbers of the species. There are areas that have sparse populations. There are habitats that are empty, that could potentially have tigers and they don't. And the argument that we're making broadly is that the intersection of these two systems, obviously of the social systems and ecological systems, that's the ecosystems themselves and attributes of those, determine the issue of interest for today, that's human-wildlife conflict, or if you flip the coin, coexistence, and more broadly, conservation outcomes. We as conservationists want to see more of species X or Y or Z on the landscape and so on. Next. Here's sort of a framework that's been a touchstone for some of us. We've been tinkering around with versions of this for a while and trying to think of ways to operationalize it. So there's a lot going on here. Let me, and this borrows broadly from sort of socio-ecological systems framing. Obviously, it's not applied to common pool resources or anything of that sort here. But broadly, if we just focus on the social systems here first, we are saying that these systems are composed or comprised of actors, diverse actors, and you can measure or quantify certain properties or certain attributes of these groups and communities. For example, you can say there are X number of people living in a certain area. They stratify, socioeconomically and so on along certain lines. You can look at culture and other attributes as well. They associate with wildlife in different ways. They have different histories of associating with forests and wildlife and so on. And the ways in which they engage with forests or natural ecosystems and wildlife may also differ greatly. They may subsist off them, they may depend on them heavily, they may have nothing to do with them, they may value them in widely different ways. And likewise, so if we shift to governance systems, and these are just examples. You can populate this list with just as many attributes as you think are useful or relevant in a given context. So, of course, there's national laws and legislation, but then the operationalization or the ways in which those play out in different contexts, there's more political stability in some areas, there's less in others. There's a government that promotes policies that are more aligned with conservation in some areas or against in others and so on. But there could also be a lot of regionally and locally norms that are either age-old sort of traditions that are governed through local institutions or through other mechanisms that where cultural systems have been sort of preserved or maintained. So I'll come to the lower tier later. But if we look at the ecologically at what's going on, obviously forget those codes and all that. But at one level, you just say how extensive is this system, and then you say how fragmented is it, how patchy is it, where is it located vis-a-vis other areas in a certain geography and so on. And then you can look at attributes of, I've done this at some point in a tiger context, so ignore the terminology. So you can just replace prey with wildlife. This is species X. And you can just say, so at some point, these are things that we can quantify. How many animals are there in a given space? At what densities do they exist? At what rates are they replacing themselves? What are population trends and demographic trends and so on? Just moving on. We're basically saying, so somewhere in the measurement of human-wildlife conflict and so on, in the previous slide, I basically said the interactions between all of this are determining outcomes here in terms of conflict and coexistence. As a conservation community, we ultimately care about this, saying we want to maintain species on a landscape, right? And the one term that we're trying to operationalize here, I'm going to ignore all this. We're saying some of this will hopefully help us to get to a very abstract, and difficult construct called ecological carrying capacity. Put that aside. We're making an argument to say that ultimately, the number of realized densities of a species in a landscape is a function of the social carrying capacity of a landscape, which is a set of cultural, economic, political, and other factors that sort of come together in various ways. And I'll try and flesh this out a little bit more as we move on. Next, please. So before I go there, I think there's one common issue in the framing of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence has been the conflating the lack of wildlife in an area as a coexistence issue vis-a-vis an issue of use or exploitation of a species, right? So can you go back to the first slide? Okay, so if we look at this map again, how many people would argue that the lack of a species of tigers in this area is because of a lack of coexistence? Is that really the core issue? Show of hands. Do you think there's, is it primarily a coexistence issue that you're seeing smaller towers here or the lack of tigers here? And if it's not coexistence, what is it? Habitat, no, the habitat's there. No, but first, so show of hands, do you think it's primarily a coexistence issue that you're not seeing as many tigers as you might expect in parts of Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand? Yes or no? If yes, hands up, please. No, hands up. I think I've confused my audience. Okay, so let's move on. So the argument that I'm basically going to frame here is to say if you're seeing empty habitats here, no, so it may be. We don't know for sure, but here's the other. So move on to that slide, please. Okay, so here's how I'm approaching this problem. I'm saying in any of those patches on that map, I'd start by saying, and you can frame this again in the context of a conservation problem. Here, the problem that we placed before us was we want to affect the recovery of a species, say tigers in this case, which is obviously a goal in many areas. So the question we start with, are there enough wild herbivores in an area? So in any of those green polygons, okay, carry on please, next. So if the answer was no, then there's a variety of investigations that you can pursue. You can say there aren't enough because these forests are just too disturbed. We can say the habitats are not productive enough, there isn't enough water in the dry season, vegetation's been altered, invasive species have proliferated, whatever it is. Or you can say maybe hunting is a key driver, historic or current or whatever, but their numbers are decimated to a point where these species don't exist in reasonable numbers in the landscape. Or there are other factors, climate-related, disease, and so on. So I'm going to hone in on this one, because I think it's sort of the elephant in the room in many areas. And so if there's hunting, is it potentially linked to crop depredation and retaliation on account of that? Is it linked to food security and just people trying to source protein? Or is it just cultural? Is it a way of life? And then if you say it could be any of these, if you think it's linked to crop depredation, then you sort of get into this sphere of conflict, of human-wildlife conflict, and thereby coexistence and so on. So I think before we even get to this framing of conflict and coexistence and so on, there's a lot of understanding that has to be built about these systems and about the sorts of, the distribution and abundance of species on a landscape, and the ways in which people engage with wildlife. Next, please. And if there was a yes, then there's other sort of inquiries to make. As ecologists, we might say, how are these species distributed on the landscape? How homogeneous or inhomogeneous are these distributions? What are population trends like? Are there as many numbers of a species as can be sustained based on the resources in that area? And finally, are there high levels of conflict? Again, there's a line that links back to this bubble. So move on, please. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. But if you go back to that first map, the argument that I might make is that in many of those areas, coexistence may, if there are no tigers, the question of coexistence doesn't arise at this moment, right? So the answer there, I would have said, is probably a flat no. But with a caveat that if you were to bring tigers back to that area, they may or may not be accepted immediately, right? So because there is no memory of living with tigers, there's a fear and so on. So it's not to say it's not in the frame, but the primary problem there may just be that the prey base that sustains an apex predator doesn't exist in the densities that it should. So in all of this, we can't immediately operationalize something as complex as a social carrying capacity. But we said, okay, so one way of looking at that is saying, what if we try to in some way, quantify or measure coexistence in a landscape? Because coexistence in a way is a proxy for the social carrying capacity. Now that is almost as hard a sort of construct to disentangle and make sense of. But here's how we are attempting to do it in one landscape. So we ran some surveys across the Tarayak landscape in North India. And the questions that we had up front, and we did this across, not around one PA and so on, across a whole landscape spanning 800 odd kilometers in length and 50,000 square kilometers in area, whatever it is. And we covered a number of villages. We stratified based on the broad sort of ethnic groups and communities in that area. So also economically where people stood and so on to get representation and we approached this by first trying to quantify costs. What are costs that people face from wildlife? And risks. And for risks, we'd say, can you map out for us? We'd show them a map of their village and say, can you map out for us where you encounter wildlife or where you encounter risks in different forms? And on this spectrum, we wouldn't necessarily enter these conversations with discussions about wildlife. Sometimes the risk came from floodwaters in the monsoon. Sometimes the risk came from malarial mosquitoes. Sometimes it came from bandits in the area, whatever else. But somewhere in that spectrum, wildlife may or may not appear. We would hone on wildlife if it came up. Next, please. And I'm going to skip the content in between. I'll come back to it. Okay, just this color gradient. So one way or the other, you can sort of, on a relative scale, say that a person's costs or risks lie somewhere along that spectrum. Very simplistically. Very high costs would be bright red. Low costs would be a green, for example. And at this end of the spectrum, if you look at how sort of coexistence is defined in sort of popular parlance or definitions now, you'll see this is squarely embedded in those definitions. So at this end of the spectrum also, from the responses we get, we can potentially classify them as people saying sort of a higher legitimacy for the presence of wildlife in a certain area, or lower legitimacy. Red being lower legitimacy, low acceptance, green being higher. Next, please. And then we are saying, so imagine that you have a red here, and you have a green here. Right? So we're saying that's a situation where there's high conflict, and still there's social legitimacy for wildlife, a situation where potentially there's more coexistence. You could have a red at both ends. You could have a green there and a red here. Communities that, in the situation, Wayanad comes to mind. Aditro and I were having a conversation. A tiger, he was saying a tiger sort of disrupts 3 banana trees in a plantation and there's havoc. Or it takes down a cow and there's havoc. Elephant sort of does that in a plantation, or a tiger takes down a cow. And the Tarai, 1,000 heads of cattle are lost around Corbett every year, and life generally goes on. So, next please. And the idea is that for each, so we identify 3 or 4 pieces, and all of these fit into sort of various constructs of coexistence, however they're defined and understood. And so we're saying if we're able to identify at some level coping mechanisms, and I've said including hunting here, because hunting, mind you, is an age-old coping mechanism, right? So if a tiger is constantly killing cows, it's no surprise that a community might go after that animal and take it out. And the key point here is they'll take one tiger out or two or three, not the species as a whole. Now they won't do it themselves anymore. They depend on the government, which brings us to sort of mechanisms of governance and the management of human-wildlife conflict. So our next set of questions was around how effective are these mechanisms? What mechanisms exist? How effective are they? Are you able to avail of them? Do they give you the kind of recourse that you need in timelines that matter? This includes obviously everything from compensation to the whole slew of measures. And then we know that this could intersect other forms of other sort of conflicts. So conflicts around resource access, around tenure, those sorts of issues that can sometimes sort of muddy the waters when it comes to human-wildlife interactions or people's sort of willingness to, or ability to exist with wildlife. So basically the contention is if we're able to identify some of these pieces, we'll be able to potentially understand why a red here translates to a red here or a green here or something in between, at least in theory. So we don't have all the analysis worked out. We're sort of trying to figure out various metrics to get there, but that's sort of the endeavor. Next, please. And then along the way, there's this whole idea of, we have as many large charismatic mammals in India as we do because, there's cultures of coexistence that are built into ways of life and so on. And so we thought we'd also try and sort of generate evidence for some of this along the way. So in parallel with these surveys, we got a few anthropologists who came on board, and they then, and they were aghast because they said, this is not how we operate. And I don't know if Venkat's in the room, but they said, we spend weeks and months or years working with communities, and you're giving us a day to go and make sense of something. But nonetheless, their task was to go and, collect information through oral histories on sort of their memories or sort of current traditions around nature broadly, but more specifically around wildlife. Okay, next, please. So this is what coverage looks like for us. We were able to sort of survey, and if you think of this landscape, it's really literally the most densely populated region of the world. So this looks impressive on a map, but it's really quite sparse. Nonetheless, and basically, I'll give you a sense of what's going on in this landscape. These areas here experience some of the highest levels of conflict with large carnivores anywhere in the world today. Here's Corbett National Park. Wildlife densities here, tiger densities are 5-fold higher than they are in Dudhwa and Pilibhit. Conflict with humans is many, many-fold lower. Right, so also the relationships between wildlife population densities and human densities and so on, they're far from linear. They're complex. And so to make the argument that more wildlife means more conflict per se, especially in terms of human casualties and so on, is just not justified. And hopefully we'll also start generating some understanding on how these relationships play out in different contexts. Next, please. And this is my last slide. So in all of this, what we haven't explicitly sort of built into the model yet is the fact that both humans and animals are adapting to sort of novel contexts and habitats, almost in real time now. And this is an image from Uttar Pradesh that you may have seen. As freakish as it looks, and I've had a conversation with Ravi Chelam on this before, and it seems like a complete anomaly. But I've made the argument: how many of you have been to Ranthambore or to Bandhavgarh or to? Are you aghast when you see a tiger surrounded by 50 gypsies and it just sort of lolls around? So this is not very different. This is the life this tiger knows. It's sort of grown up in the sugarcane fields. It's not like every tiger is going to behave like this. There is behavioral plasticity among individuals, but it's not completely anomalous for an animal to start displaying behavior like this in contexts like these on occasion. Next, please. And we're also seeing, for the longest time, when I was doing my PhD years ago in a division called Pilibhit, Forest Division in North India, it had 200 years of forest management, intensive sal felling and so on. And it still had many-fold higher herbivore and tiger densities than nearby PAs like Dudhwa, which had 50 years of protection. And we just couldn't figure it out. And we said this is because Pilibhit has swamplands and grasslands and areas that humans don't enter. So, tigers were persisted because they exploited these little habitats that remained somewhat inviolate, so to speak, even as there were people all around them. And what we're now learning, and this is a radio-collared tiger, we only knew she was in there because she had a collar on her. And this landscape is normally covered by sugarcane. This animal, for the time she was collared, she only moved in sugarcane fields. The moment she hit a forest edge, she would turn away from the forest back into the farmlands. That's what she saw as habitat. When they took the sugarcane away, this is how she persisted in the landscape. She exploited sort of patches of vegetation between farmlands. She stayed at the spot for a week or more, feeding on a cow. Nobody had a clue that she was there. And this is, this is how animals are adapting to the landscapes that they're now presented with. And obviously, all of this is relevant to our understanding of conflict and coexistence. So that's it from me. Thanks.